Tunisia, February 1943. The sun hung low and merciless, baking the desert into glass. A column of Panzer Puers stood idle near Kasserine Pass, their crews lounging beside the tanks, smoking, laughing, waiting for the next American mistake. They had grown used to it by now, the clumsy new enemy with too many supplies and too little sense. The German crews mocked them openly. "They build with tin," one gunner joked. "Even their tanks sound hollow." His comrades laughed, passing around a tattered propaganda leaflet captured from U.S. lines. It showed a strange drawing, an American soldier kneeling, aiming what looked like a metal tube on his shoulder. The caption beneath it, translated crudely, read, "New American rocket infantry weapon, capable of destroying tanks." The laughter turned to howls. A toy. A firework launcher. The Americans will scare our tanks with fireworks next. The crewman rolled the paper into a tube, pretending to aim it like a child's toy. "Bang! Panzer kaput!" one yelled, collapsing in exaggerated death. Even the officers joined in. They didn't know it yet, but in less than 2 years, those same jokes would die in flames. The Germans had reason to scoff. For decades, they'd defined armored warfare. From Poland to France to the Russian steppe, their panzer divisions had been unstoppable, steel beasts backed by precision doctrine. Infantry weapons? They'd seen them all. Molotovs, mines, rifles, even the awkward British boys' anti-tank gun, all useless against the 50mm of Krupp steel that shielded their machines. No man could stop a tank. That was an iron law of war, until America tried to break it. Across the ocean, at the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Grounds, engineers were quietly experimenting with a concept no army had taken seriously: a shoulder-fired rocket that could pierce armor. It was the brainchild of Colonel Leslie Skinner and Engineer Edward Ohl, a desperate response to the M3 Lee and Sherman's early humiliation in North Africa. American infantry had learned the hard way what armor dominance meant. German tanks could sit on ridgelines, slaughtering infantry at will. Even when Bazooka prototypes arrived, few soldiers trusted them. They jammed, misfired, or fizzled in the sand. Early versions overheated after 3 shots. Rocket propellant burned unevenly, throwing aim wildly off. And when they worked, the tiny 2.36-inch warhead looked far too small to threaten a panzer. At field demonstrations, soldiers laughed and called it the firecracker. Even General Eisenhower had doubts. "It's clever," he said, "but I don't see it changing anything." What no one yet realized was that the concept, not the performance, was revolutionary. The Germans had already glimpsed a similar idea during their own experiments. Back in 1918, their scientists had designed crude rocket projectors, but the technology was abandoned after the armistice. In 1942, reports of American tube rockets reached Berlin, but the Ordnance Board dismissed them as fantasy. Colonel Wilhelm Schlepper of the Panzertruppen wrote, "If the Americans think a foot soldier can destroy a panzer, they misunderstand physics. Infantry is for the trenches. Armor is for war." Those words would age like ashes. By the spring of 1943, small batches of the M1 Bazooka had arrived in Tunisia. They were crude: wire sights, wooden grips, and a flimsy battery ignition system that often failed under dust and heat. Infantrymen distrusted it. Officers often left them behind to carry rifles or mortars instead. But in one obscure engagement near El Guetar, a young lieutenant named Charles Lucky Patterson decided to gamble on the weapon nobody wanted. Pinned by 2 Panzer IIIs advancing up a ridge, Patterson's men had nothing left. No artillery, no tank support, only 2 of the strange new launchers. They fired both. The first rocket missed. The second hit dead center on the turret ring. The explosion wasn't spectacular. just a dull, hard thud. Then smoke began to pour from the commander's hatch. The German tank halted. The crew bailed, and for the first time in the war, an American infantry unit had destroyed a German tank without artillery. The men stood stunned. Then someone whispered, "It worked." Word spread through the ranks like rumor through a foxhole. A toy rocket had killed a tank. German intelligence took note. Field reports labeled it Handrakettenwerfer, infantry rocket thrower. At first, they thought it was an isolated stunt. Then came more reports, small American squads ambushing armor from ditches, convoys losing lead tanks to invisible attackers, engines gutted by shaped charges that burned through steel like a torch through butter. What the Germans didn't yet know was that inside that toy was a principle that would reshape modern combat, the heat warhead or high-explosive anti-tank. Unlike traditional explosives that relied on blunt force, heat used a shaped copper cone and focused detonation to melt through armor. It didn't smash tanks, it burned through them. To the German crews, it seemed like sorcery. No shell impact, no trajectory, just a hiss, a flash, and a hole glowing red. For now, they still laughed. But the laughter had a nervous edge. Because even in Tunisia, amid the sand and arrogance, there was a whisper moving through the ranks. The Americans are learning. Spring 1943. The United States was learning humility by the crate. Every battle in North Africa had exposed new weaknesses. Underpowered tanks, green officers, and men whose courage outpaced their equipment. American troops watched German panzers roll through their lines like thunderheads over sand. In the field manuals, infantry were told to attack the flanks or call for artillery. In reality, they ducked behind rocks and prayed the tanks would ignore them. But in the dusty workshops of Aberdeen and Fort Benning, a small group of engineers believed they had found an answer. A simple, ungainly tube that could put tank-killing power into the hands of one man. They called it the Bazooka. Edward Uhl, the young engineer who wired the first ignition system, later said it looked like a plumber's nightmare. Nobody believed it would work. Not even us. The Army Ordnance Department had authorized limited testing. They built 5,000 units and shipped them straight to the front. No manuals, no doctrine, just faith. Each launcher was a hollow steel tube, 5 feet long, firing a 2.36-inch rocket with a shaped explosive warhead. It had no recoil, no smoke, and an unreliable battery that failed under humidity. Soldiers nicknamed it the pea shooter, but the engineers kept refining it. By late 1943, reports from Tunisia reached Washington. The weapon had actually destroyed several German tanks. Army Command, shocked but intrigued, demanded mass production. The Signal Corps built new wiring systems. The warhead was redesigned with a copper liner. Within 6 months, tens of thousands of M1A1 bazookas were shipped to Sicily, Italy, and the Pacific. At first, no one wanted to carry it. It was awkward, fragile, and dangerous to operate. The rockets were sensitive to moisture. One bad primer could detonate in the tube. Many soldiers quietly ditched theirs in the sand. Infantry manuals warned, never fire from enclosed positions. Never fire near friendly personnel. Never trust the first shot. But desperation overruled caution. In the hills of Sicily, U.S. Rangers ambushed a German convoy outside Troina. One of them, Sergeant Ruddick, aimed a bazooka from behind a low wall. The rocket screamed toward a Panzer IV. It hit, not with a blast, but a hiss and a hole. Flames erupted inside. The tank brewed up in seconds. Ruddick wrote later, "It didn't feel like a gun. It felt like a miracle." The Germans, now on the receiving end, were baffled. Post-action reports mentioned portable fire tubes and electrical grenade launchers. Berlin's Ordnance Bureau demanded samples. None were captured intact until late 1943, when a damaged bazooka fell into German hands near Salerno. It was rushed to Peenemünde for analysis. What they discovered stunned them. The Americans had built a weapon their own scientists had theorized years before, but dismissed as impractical. Within weeks, German engineers reverse-engineered it into a heavier, more dangerous version, the Panzerschreck, or Tank Terror. Ironically, the weapon the Germans had mocked became their model. Meanwhile, American commanders began to realize they'd created something bigger than a stopgap. At Normandy planning conferences, General Omar Bradley asked his ordnance chief, "How many bazookas can an army carry?" The answer, "As many as you can make, sir." Factories back home were already running around the clock. Detroit's auto lines, once building Buicks and Packards, were now stamping steel tubes by the mile. Women on assembly floors, the same Rosies who built bombers, were soldering rocket igniters and painting warning labels. Caution, rocket, anti-tank M6. In just 1 year, production jumped from 5,000 to over 500,000 units. The toy rocket was becoming one of the most mass-produced weapons in the Allied arsenal. By early 1944, every American infantry platoon in Europe had at least 2 bazooka teams. They trained to move in pairs. 1 gunner, 1 loader. The launcher rested on the shoulder. The loader dropped the rocket, flipped the safety, and shouted, "Ready!" The weapon fired with a hollow roar. Its backblast kicked up dust and smoke. Deadly for concealment, but terrifying in sound. The effect on morale was immediate. Infantrymen who once felt powerless now had teeth. Private Harold Lewis, 1st Infantry Division, said, "Before, when tanks came, we ran. Now we wait." Back in Germany, the laughter stopped. Captured documents from late 1943 show panic in the Panzer Command. Reports from North Africa and Italy warned that enemy infantry carry new short-range rocket projectors capable of piercing 75 mm armor. Colonel Heinz Guderian, reviewing one such report, scribbled in the margin, "If true, this changes everything." He didn't know how right he was, because the next time the Germans rolled through hedgerows in the fields of Normandy, every bush, every ditch, every farm wall would hide an American bazooka team waiting for them. Normandy, June 1944. For the men of the 29th Infantry Division, the world was mud, hedgerows, and the sound of distant engines. The invasion had succeeded. Barely. The beaches were secured, the villages smoking. But inland, beyond the fields of bocage, German armor regrouped. Panthers, Tigers, and assault guns moved like ghosts behind the hedges, waiting for the Americans to show themselves. The infantry advanced cautiously. They could hear the panzers before they saw them, the deep growl of Maybach engines echoing through the earth. And when they appeared, the men finally understood why the Germans had believed themselves invincible. The first Panther that came through the hedgerow was a mountain of steel, its 75mm gun sweeping the fields like a spotlight. Machine guns tore through the grass, and a half-track exploded in seconds. Private Robert Gill from Kentucky remembered the terror. You couldn't hide. The hedges boxed us in. You couldn't run either. There was nowhere to go. Pinned and desperate, the platoon sergeant shouted, "Bazooka! Up front!" A 2-man team scrambled through the mud. Corporal Eddie Shaw and his loader, Charlie Vance. They had only 3 rockets left, each precious as gold. Eddie found a break in the hedge, braced the tube on his shoulder, and sighted the tank through the wire ring. The barrel of the Panther was swinging toward them. He fired. The rocket shot out with a hiss, too low. It hit the ground and skipped, detonating beneath the treads. The explosion wasn't cinematic, just a dull, metallic pop, but the result was instant. The right track sheared off, and the tank slewed sideways, trapped. A second shot burned through the engine deck. Flames erupted. The hatches flew open, and the crew bailed. coughing in smoke. For the Americans watching, the impossible had happened. A two-man team had stopped a German tank. After the battle, the survivors gathered around the still-burning wreck. Someone muttered, "Guess it ain't a toy anymore." Another replied, "Tell Berlin." News of the bazooka's success spread fast. In hedgerow country, where visibility was often no more than 30 yards, it became the infantry's equalizer. German armor crews, once confident, began to hesitate. They no longer rolled into villages without scouting. Every barn, every crater, every corpse could hide a bazooka tube. German intelligence reports from July 1944 reveal growing alarm. One field officer wrote, "Enemy infantry now attack tanks at extremely close range with handheld rockets. Our troops call them ghost gunners. They appear, fire once, and vanish." Another noted grimly, "Panzer morale declining. Crews fear the American rocket more than artillery." That was no exaggeration. At the Battle of St. Lo, an entire armored column was delayed for 6 hours because scouts reported infantry with rockets in the orchards. Only 3 bazooka teams were actually there. But the fear was, enough, the bazookas. Effectiveness wasn't magic. It was math. The heat warhead didn't rely on speed or impact. It created a focused jet of molten copper traveling over 6,000 feet per second, cutting through armor like butter. The Panther's 80mm plate could stop shells, but not that concentrated beam. Germans tried adding side skirts and sandbags, but nothing worked. The weapon was small, mobile, and deadly. A single hit could destroy a 45-ton tank. In one field near Caen, British infantry attached to U.S. forces captured a burned-out Tiger I. Inside, they found the gunner's logbook. Its last entry read, "Rocket fire from left flank. Armor melted. Abandoning vehicle." That was the moment Allied High Command realized. The bazooka had changed not just tactics, it had changed psychology. Back in the German camps, the laughter that had once greeted the toy rocket had turned to silence. Field Marshal Rommel, recovering from an airstrike in July, received a report detailing the weapon's success. He read it twice, then underlined a single sentence. "Enemy infantry now possess a weapon that makes every man a threat to armor." He turned to his aide and said quietly, "So the battlefield has changed again. They have given the common soldier the power of artillery." In the hedgerows, American soldiers gave their own verdict. The bazooka was no longer a novelty. It was a lifeline. One sergeant put it best in his after-action report. "A rifle gives you courage. A bazooka gives you hope." The U.S. Army quickly adapted. Infantry units began training specifically for anti-tank ambushes, hiding in barns, trenches, and even manure piles to mask the rocket's backblast. They learned to aim for vision ports, tracks, and rear plates. They learned that 2 hits meant certainty. By midsummer 1944, the German High Command was referring to the bazooka as a strategic nuisance, a small weapon causing disproportionate damage. But the nuisance was only beginning. Because when the Americans broke out of Normandy, the toy rockets came with them, hidden in trucks, carried by every platoon, ready to meet the iron columns waiting beyond the hedges. By July 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy had become a graveyard for tanks. Panthers burned in fields where cattle once grazed. Stooges sat abandoned at crossroads, their crews long gone. The air reeked of gasoline, cordite, and wet soil. German tankers had stopped laughing entirely. The weapon they'd mocked, that crude, shoulder-fired tube, had become the nightmare of every panzer crewman in France. In early July, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, tried to retake a village south of St. Lo. They rolled in with 12 tanks, confident that the shattered American infantry couldn't resist a counterattack. What they didn't know was that a dozen U.S. Bazooka teams were waiting behind the walls and hedges. The first rocket came from a churchyard. It struck a Panther's side plate, blowing the track clean off. Before the crew could react, another rocket smashed into the rear armor. Flames burst from the turret. Within minutes, 4 German tanks were burning. The rest reversed out of town, blind, panicked, firing into smoke. When the battle ended, U.S. soldiers found something odd among the wrecks. A scorched propaganda leaflet left in a tank commander's compartment. It was the same one that had circulated in North Africa. A cartoon of an American with a toy rocket. Someone had scrawled across it in pencil. Not a toy. By late July, the bazooka was everywhere. Each American division carried thousands of rockets. Truck convoys followed infantry columns with crates of ammunition marked M6A1, rocket, anti-tank. When Operation Cobra began, the massive breakout from Normandy, bazooka teams advanced right behind the tanks. Their job was simple: hunt German armor in close quarters. They were young, usually in their late teens, armed with a weapon that could kill a machine 10 times their size. Private Leo Barker, 4th Infantry Division, remembered one fight near Perrier. The Panthers were coming down the road 2 by 2. You could feel them before you saw them. The ground shook. We hid in the ditches, waited for the last one to pass, then hit them from behind. I fired once, missed. The loader slapped another in, and I hit the second tank dead in the engine. It went up like a torch. That day, his 2-man team destroyed 3 tanks. Barker was 19. The Germans called it Panzerangst, tank terror. They had once inflicted it on others. Now, they felt it themselves. Reports to Army Group B described enemy rocket ambushes at all ranges, including within 30 meters. Crews began welding makeshift armor, track links, sandbags, even bed frames, to their tanks. Nothing helped. A single bazooka round could burn through 80 mm of armor in a pinpoint jet. For the first time, infantry controlled the battlefield. Captured German tankers gave testimony that bordered on disbelief. One Panther commander, interrogated after St. Lo, said, "We thought the Americans were mad. No man would face a tank alone. But they came at us, 2 or 3 at a time. They fired from holes, from windows, from trees. You could not see them until the rocket hit you." Another report from the 17th Panzer Grenadier Division read, "The enemy rockets cause extreme fear among the crews. Even the thickest armor cannot guarantee safety. The infantry refused to advance without tanks, and the tanks refused to move without infantry." The balance of power had shifted. What terrified the Germans most wasn't the weapon's lethality. It was its simplicity. Every American infantryman could use it. It didn't need precision. It didn't require engineers or artillery. It just needed courage and a clear shot. It turned war from a contest of machines back into a contest of men. In the ruins of St. Lo, a German intelligence officer wrote in his diary, "We trained our soldiers to trust the tank, to believe in its invincibility. But the Americans have made it mortal. They have given every farm boy the power to destroy a panzer." He was right. By August, entire German battalions were being halted not by tanks, not by planes, but by invisible rocket teams. The U.S. Army began publishing field guides titled "Tank Killing with the Bazooka." The instructions were simple. Wait for the side or rear shot. Aim low. Fire twice. Move immediately. The average lifespan of a bazooka team in combat was short, often under 3 engagements, but they kept volunteering. Private Thomas Hurley said before the breakout at Avranches, "If it's you or the tank, you make sure it's the tank." When the breakout finally came, the toy rockets were there, lined up on the backs of trucks, strapped to jeeps, even carried on bicycles. As the panzers retreated toward Falaise, U.S. bazooka teams chased them through the smoke. Columns that had once rolled through France like juggernauts now burned by the roadside, destroyed not by air raids or artillery, but by infantry with tubes. German soldiers started calling the weapon by a grim nickname, Der Fluch des Panzers, the curse of the tank. In 2 years, the bazooka had gone from a laboratory curiosity to the most feared infantry weapon in Europe. Its impact rippled through the German high command. At a conference in Paris, General Heinrich Eberbach told his staff, "We have lost the armor advantage. Every field, every bush hides death. The Americans have made tanks obsolete." He wasn't exaggerating. By the time the Allies reached the Seine, the German panzer divisions were crippled, not just by fuel shortages or air attacks, but by thousands of invisible soldiers carrying pipes of vengeance. The laughter that began in Tunisia had ended in Normandy's burning fields. August 1944. The Falaise Pocket. The German army was collapsing in real time. Columns of vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, jammed every road leading east. From the air, Allied pilots described it as a river of steel. But on the ground, among the hedgerows and shattered villages, a new kind of hunter was waiting. They were small teams of American infantrymen, 2-man cells carrying a launcher and a bag of rockets. They weren't glamorous, they didn't wear medals or drive tanks, but they were about to rewrite the balance of the battlefield. It began just before dawn near Chambois. Fog rolled across the valley as retreating German units tried to force their way east under cover of mist. The 90th Infantry Division was dug in along a ridge overlooking the main road. At 5:40 a.m., they heard engines, hundreds of them. Through the gray light, an entire armored column appeared. Panthers, Stooges, Opel trucks, even horse carts loaded with ammunition. It was a convoy 50 vehicles long. Lieutenant David Rains, a quiet Texan schoolteacher before the war, raised his binoculars and whispered to his men, "Boys, they're not getting out." The first bazooka team set up behind a stone wall. They waited until the lead Panther rolled directly below them. The gunner fired at 40 yards, almost point blank. The rocket hit the side armor and blew the tread clean off. The tank skidded sideways, blocking the road. The convoy froze. Before the Germans could react, half a dozen more rockets whooshed out from the hedgerows. The second tank went up in flames. The column was trapped, and the Americans kept firing. Private Al Jenkins remembered it vividly. They were yelling, panicking. Trucks rear-ended each other, tanks trying to turn around on roads too narrow. We just kept hitting them, one after another. It was like knocking over dominoes made of fire. When it was over, 11 tanks and 27 trucks were burning. The Germans called in artillery to blast the hill, but the bazooka teams were already gone, melted back into the fog. They'd fired 22 rockets and broken an entire division's retreat. Scenes like that repeated across France. From Mortagne to Argentan, German withdrawal routes became killing zones. The Luftwaffe was gone, fuel was scarce, and every road seemed haunted by invisible rocketeers. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's reports to Berlin grew desperate. Enemy infantry possess anti-tank weapons of great effectiveness. Columns cannot move by day. Losses catastrophic. Morale shaken. For the panzer crews who survived, the psychological toll was immense. A tank's armor, once a fortress, now felt like a coffin. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow behind a wall could mean annihilation. The Americans, emboldened, began pushing tactics even further. They mounted bazookas on jeeps, half-tracks, and scout cars, turning them into improvised rocket wagons. Patton's Third Army took the idea and ran with it. Recon units would drive ahead of the main columns, firing bazookas at range like mobile artillery. The Germans never knew what hit them. They'd hear the hiss, see the flash, and then watch their vehicles detonate. One report from the 4th Armored Division noted dryly, "Enemy morale deteriorating rapidly. Infantry surrendering before firing. Tanks abandoned intact." In late August, Allied intelligence intercepted a desperate German radio message. "We have encountered American troops armed with rocket launchers in every hedgerow. Tanks cannot advance. Request air support immediately." But there was no air support left to send. For all their engineering brilliance, the Germans had run out of answers. They had built the most advanced tanks in the world, the Tiger and Panther, but they were being destroyed by farm boys with 5-foot pipes. It was technological irony of the highest order. In Berlin, the High Command demanded countermeasures. The Ordnance Bureau suggested thicker skirts, mesh screens, or concrete coating on hulls. All were tested. None worked. The physics of the heat warhead made armor irrelevant. The copper cone focused the explosion into a needle of molten metal, slicing through steel like paper. No matter how much plating they added, the bazooka found a way in. Wehrmacht technical report in September concluded bitterly. There is no defense against the American rocket weapon except distance and luck. German propaganda tried to downplay it, calling it a coward's weapon. But even Goebbels' ministry couldn't hide the numbers. By fall 1944, more German tanks were lost to bazookas and Piats than to aircraft. The myth of the invincible Panzer was over. Captured crews told the same story again and again. They no longer feared airstrikes or artillery. They feared the silence, the moments before a hiss in the hedges. One veteran tanker said during interrogation, "At least bombs you can see. Bazookas, you only hear once." That single sentence captured the essence of a battlefield turned upside down. By the time the Falaise pocket closed, German armor had ceased to be an offensive weapon. It was now a liability, a moving target in a land of ambushers. The bazooka had done more than destroy tanks. September 1944. Belgium. The fields were quiet, too quiet for comfort. Dew clung to the grass, and the distant clank of tracks echoed through the mist like a heartbeat. Inside the lead panther of the 9th Panzer Division, Sergeant Otto Heller rubbed his temples and muttered, "They're here. I can feel it." His driver laughed nervously. "Who, the Americans?" Heller shook his head. "No, the ghosts. The ones with the pipes." That was what German tankers called them now. Geister mit den Rohren. Ghosts with the tubes. They had learned to fear what they could not see. Bazooka teams didn't announce themselves. They didn't move like infantry or fight like artillery. They appeared, fired once, and vanished. Every German after-action report from that autumn carried the same tone of exhaustion and disbelief. Entire armored companies destroyed by small, unseen enemies. Convoys forced to travel at night, or risk annihilation by dawn. The mighty panzers, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, were reduced to cautious, creeping beasts. In one report, General Eberbach complained bitterly, "Our tanks advance 50 meters, then halt for fear of ambush. We are fighting shadows and losing." The German army tried to adapt. Orders went out to mount Schürzen, metal skirts, on tank sides to detonate rockets early. Crews draped bed springs and mesh wire around turrets. But the bazooka's shaped charge ignored these measures. The molten jet simply burned through everything, its narrow cone unaffected by improvised armor. In desperation, some commanders ordered infantry to precede every tank, human shields walking 10 paces ahead. But even that failed. The bazooka teams just waited until the soldiers passed, then struck the tank behind them. In the Allied ranks, word of the German panic spread like wildfire. American infantry began to notice something strange. The enemy's tanks were less aggressive, their movements hesitant. A new phrase entered the front-line slang. Bazooka calm. The eerie stillness that came when German armor refused to advance. Corporal Louis Romano described it in his letters home. You could tell when they'd seen a bazooka team before. Their tanks slowed down, stopped every 50 yards, and fired into bushes for 10 minutes straight. It was fear, plain and simple. At the same time, U.S. Army Command began analyzing just how deep that fear ran. Captured documents revealed that entire panzer units had been forced to alter doctrine. No more daring breakthroughs, no more thunder runs across open fields. Tanks now advanced only behind smoke screens or at night. And still, the losses mounted. A German intelligence summary from late September read, "Enemy infantry armed with rocket tubes now dominate the battlefield. Armor cannot advance without heavy artillery and air cover. The tank is no longer decisive. For the German High Command, veterans of the Blitzkrieg age, it was heresy. But facts don't respect pride." Meanwhile, on the American side, the weapon was evolving again. The new M9 Bazooka, with improved electrical ignition and extended range, began arriving in the field. It was lighter, more reliable, and deadly accurate up to 250 yards. Teams grew bolder. They began hunting tanks in open daylight, waiting at road bends and intersections. German officers described it as death by inches. Every kilometer of road had to be scouted, every hedge cleared, every ruin shelled before a tank dared move forward. For an army built on speed, this paralysis was fatal. By October, even elite divisions like Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler were suffering catastrophic attrition. Their reports read less like military assessments and more like laments. One captain wrote, "The men no longer believe in their machines. They listen for the hiss of the rocket before every maneuver. We fight not the enemy, but our own nerves." In Berlin, Albert Speer's ministry was deluged with frantic requests for countermeasures. Some engineers proposed building a tank too thick for rockets to penetrate, the monstrous Maus. Others proposed flame screens or electric jammers, but none of these could be built fast enough to matter. By the time the blueprints reached the factories, the war had already moved on. The Americans didn't wait for battleships of steel. They had turned war into a contest of agility, of men with tubes versus men in coffins of armor. One interrogation report from a captured Panther commander summarized it bluntly. "Our tanks die the same way now, not by big guns, but by small ones we cannot find. The battlefield belongs to the man with the rocket." Even Hitler, in a briefing at the Wolf's Lair, reportedly flew into a rage when told of the bazooka's success. He dismissed it as propaganda, but his generals knew better. The once proud panzer divisions were bleeding out, destroyed not by superweapons or genius generals, but by $19 tubes fired by men half their age. The fear became self-fulfilling. German tank crews began abandoning intact vehicles after the first near miss. Some refused to move without infantry escorts. Others welded their hatches shut and carried grenades to avoid capture when hit. Panzer doctrine, the heart of German strategy, was collapsing from within. A U.S. Army intelligence analyst summed it up best. The Germans built tanks to break through men. The Americans built a weapon to make men break tanks. By November, Allied forces were pushing toward the Rhine. Behind them lay the smoldering wreckage of thousands of German vehicles. Victims of air power, artillery, and above all, bazooka teams. Each destroyed tank told the same story. Arrogance meeting innovation, pride meeting physics. The toy rocket had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It didn't just destroy machines, it destroyed confidence. And for an army built on the myth of mechanical superiority, that loss of faith was fatal. In the frozen forests ahead, the Germans were planning one last gamble. The Ardennes offensive. They would throw everything they had left into a winter counterattack. But among the veterans who'd survived Normandy and Falaise, one question lingered like smoke over the snow. What if the ghosts are waiting for us there, too? December 1944. The Ardennes. The forest slept under snow, muffling every sound, except one. Engines. Hundreds of them. German tanks, hidden for weeks, now roaring to life in a surprise counterattack that would become Hitler's final gamble. The Allied front buckled. Convoys burned, communications snapped, and frozen infantry units found themselves surrounded. And among the chaos, once again, the question returned. Could a few men with rockets stop the heaviest tanks in the world? The German offensive threw everything into the snow. Panthers, Tigers, King Tigers, armored half-tracks, and desperate orders to break through to Antwerp. To the Germans, it felt like 1940 again. The Ardennes roads were clogged with iron and hope. But this time, the enemy waiting for them wasn't unprepared France. It was a battle-hardened American army, armed with lessons and bazookas. The first major encounter came near Lanzerath. A U.S. infantry company, cut off and freezing, spotted armor approaching through the trees. Tiger tanks, enormous and indifferent to the terrain, rumbled forward like ancient beasts. The Americans had no artillery, no tank support, and little ammo. But they had bazookas, a dozen of them. With 6 rockets each, Lieutenant Paul Griffin organized his men into ambush lines along the snow-covered road. He whispered, "Don't shoot the first tank. Let them come close. We'll kill the second. Trap them." At 60 yards, they fired. The lead Tiger's engine howled. The second tank, hit squarely under the turret ring, burst into flames. Snow turned black with smoke. The third tank tried to reverse, blocking the road behind. Within minutes, the entire column was stuck. Easy prey for more rockets. The men fired until their tubes glowed red, and the air reeked of burning fuel. When it was over, 8 tanks were destroyed or abandoned. A German officer, captured days later, admitted, "We were told the Americans had few anti-tank weapons." It was a lie. They were everywhere. Across the front, similar scenes played out. At Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Trois Ponts, bazooka teams struck from basements, tree lines, and even sewer grates. They fired at silhouettes in the snow, at headlights glimmering through fog, at the sound of treads alone. In the village of Champs, one paratrooper squad destroyed 5 tanks in a single afternoon. Their commander, a grinning corporal named Jack Worth, told a reporter after the battle, "We just waited until the tanks got close enough to see our breath in the snow. Then we lit 'em up." The Germans had expected another easy victory. Instead, their offensive began to choke on its own ambition. Fuel shortages slowed the advance, and every delay was an invitation for American rocket teams to strike. The narrow roads, perfect for armored thrusts in theory, turned into kill zones in practice. Frozen ditches, burned trucks, and wrecked Tigers turned the Ardennes into a maze of steel coffins. In one of the most infamous engagements near Foy, a German King Tiger, the largest tank ever fielded, was ambushed by 2 paratroopers armed with a single M9A1 bazooka. Their names were Sergeant Walter Sheehan and Private Claude Irwin. Both had frostbitten hands and 1 rocket between them. The tank's commander, unaware of their presence, halted to orient his turret. Sheehan whispered, "We'll never get a better shot." They aimed at the rear exhaust plate, the Tiger's only real weakness. The rocket fired true. A blinding flash, a muffled thud. Then the impossible. The King Tiger, weighing 70 tons, stopped dead. Smoke poured from its vents. Moments later, its crew crawled out, surrendering to 2 half-frozen Americans armed with 1 empty launcher. When interrogated, the German commander said in disbelief, "You defeated a King Tiger with a toy." "No," Sheehan replied, "with luck and a farmer's aim." By Christmas, the snow was littered with wrecks. Panthers, half-tracks, trucks, each one with a telltale hole the size of a fist punched through its armor. The weapon that began as a battlefield curiosity had become the great equalizer of the Ardennes. German reports grew frantic. Rocket ambushes at every crossroad. Infantry morale collapsing. Armor Command requests immediate relief. The panic spread even among elite SS units. One intercepted message read, "Our tanks are being hunted like animals." For the Americans, the bazooka was more than a weapon. It was a psychological counterweight to fear. When everything else froze, when ammunition ran out and air support couldn't fly, the tube still worked. You could carry it on your back and turn terror into defiance. Private Frank Bowen wrote home from Bastogne, "We're surrounded, cold and hungry. But I've got a bazooka and 3 rockets left. If they come for us, they'll pay for every inch." He never wrote again. His weapon was found beside 3 destroyed half-tracks. By early January, the German offensive had stalled completely. The snow hid the graves of thousands, but the wrecks told the story clearly. An army that had once conquered Europe was now bleeding out in the forests of Belgium, defeated by men who fought with courage, not machines. In Berlin, generals debated whether to continue producing tanks at all. One noted grimly, "Our enemies have turned infantry into artillery. The age of the tank is over." As the thaw began, American patrols found something haunting on the frozen roads. Scattered among the burned tanks were propaganda leaflets, the same kind that had once mocked the toy rocket. But now, someone had scribbled on them in English. "Tell your rocket men. They win." Spring 1945. The war in Europe was dying. Berlin was a ruin of fire and silence. The once mighty panzer divisions were gone, their burned shells littering roads from Normandy to the Elbe. And amid that, wreckage lay a strange truth. The war that began with tanks had ended with a tube, the bazooka, the weapon. German officers had once dismissed as a child's toy had rewritten modern combat. It wasn't just a battlefield invention. It was a symbol of how the underestimated can change the world. In the final months of the war, the U.S. Army compiled its reports. The numbers told a staggering story. More than 475,000 launchers produced, over 15 million rockets fired, and thousands of enemy tanks destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned because of them. But the weapon's true legacy wasn't measured in tonnage or statistics. It was measured in what it replaced: fear. For infantrymen who once trembled at the sound of tank treads, the bazooka gave them a chance. A fighting chance. It turned the powerless into predators. Corporal Jim Darnell of the 30th Infantry summed it up best. The first time you hit a tank, and it stops, you stop being afraid of anything. After Germany's surrender, captured Wehrmacht scientists were brought to Allied interrogation centers. When asked which Allied weapon impressed them most, they didn't name the atomic bomb or the B-17. They named the bazooka. One German ordnance engineer said, "You gave every soldier the power to destroy a tank. That was genius and madness." Another simply wrote in his report, "It made bravery contagious. Even the Germans couldn't resist copying it." Their own version, the Panzerschreck, became larger and deadlier, but also cumbersome and smoky. Ironically, it revealed just how perfectly balanced the American weapon had been. Portable, simple, cheap, and fast. After the war, the Soviets built their own copy, the RPG, which would go on to shape wars for generations. From Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Ukraine, the echo of that first toy rocket would never fade. Every soldier with a shoulder-fired weapon, every insurgent, every freedom fighter would owe a quiet debt to the engineers at Aberdeen who turned plumbing pipe into power. In post-war Germany, former panzer crews were asked what they feared most. Their answers were not bombers, not artillery, not other tanks. It was the man with the tube. For them, the war's final horror wasn't the loss of cities or the advance of armies. It was realizing that the machine they'd trusted had become irrelevant. Technology had come full circle, back to the courage of the individual. The weapon even changed language. Bazooka, once a jazz musician's slang for a homemade trombone, entered every dictionary as a synonym for destruction. It became part of culture, a symbol of American ingenuity and audacity. In factories back home, the women who'd built them proudly signed their names on the tubes. Some even wrote messages, from Rosie, with love. Those signatures, faded but still visible, were found years later on wrecked launchers in Europe and the Pacific. Reminders that even in war, creation can come from the unlikeliest hands. When the guns finally fell silent, the survivors gathered stories instead of shells. Veterans of Normandy, Falaise, and the Bulge remembered the hiss of the rocket, the recoil, the sudden silence after a tank stopped moving. For many, that sound marked the moment they realized they could win. Private Eddie Shaw, the same soldier who'd crippled a Panther in Normandy, returned home to Kansas in 1946. He never spoke much about the war, but when a reporter asked him what he thought of the weapon that made him famous, he smiled faintly and said, "It wasn't the rocket that scared them. It was the idea that we'd stopped running." In military academies around the world, the bazooka became a case study, not for its engineering, though it was brilliant, but for its philosophy, the democratization of firepower. It proved that a weapon didn't have to be big to be decisive, that courage, combined with simplicity, could shatter empires. Generals who once dreamed of massive armored armies now studied how to defeat a single soldier with a rocket launcher. The future of war had been rewritten in a ditch outside St. Lo. Today, rusting hulks of German tanks still dot the countryside of France and Belgium. Their armor is pitted and blackened, silent memorials to hubris. Walk close enough and you'll see small, perfect holes, no larger than a coffee cup, drilled straight through the steel. Each one tells the same story, of laughter that turned to fear, of arrogance that met innovation, of machines that learned what courage could do. The bazooka didn't win the war alone, but it gave the men who did the means to fight back. It made the impossible possible, and turned the tide of a world that had once been overrun by steel. In the end, that's how history remembers it. Not as a weapon of destruction, but as a weapon of defiance. The Germans laughed at America's toy rockets until the day the laughter was drowned out by fire.